So I want to begin by first checking and making sure that you can all hear me this morning. Wave your hands if you can hear me. You can hear me. Okay. Sometimes when you have too many technical things, it's easier to get something messed up. So I wanted to check first. So we will now begin by reciting the prayers for refuge and bodhicitta. So as you recite these prayers, please think to yourself that we are engaging in the study and contemplation of Dharma in order to bring benefit to all sentient beings, and of course ourselves as well. So thinking in this way, please let us recite the prayers. O Sangye Chedan Tsoge Chonam La Chancho Bardo Dane Chabsum Je Dagi Chenyen Yipe Sunam Je Dola Penjer Sanje Robar Sho Sangye Chedan Tsoge Chonam La Chancho Bardo Dane Chapsum Je Dagi Chenyen Gipe Sanam Je Dola Penjer Sanje Robar Sho Sangye Chedan Tsoge Chonam La Chancho Bardo Dane Chapsum Je Dagi Chenyen Gipe Sanam Je Dola Penjer Sanje Robar Sho. Now let's recite the same words in English so we get the meaning. We have the blessings through the Tibetan. Now let's get the meaning through the English. Until enlightenment I go for refuge to the Buddha, Dharma, and the sublime Sangha. By the merit of my listening to the Dharma, may I reach Buddhahood to benefit beings. Semjen Thamje Dewa Tan Dewi Judan Dembra Jurje Donga Dan Donga Ji Judan Dawa Jurje Donga Mebe Dewa Tamba Tam Rawa Jurje Nirin Chata Nitan Rawa Tanyon Chembola Nebra Jurje. In the Dharma Expanse Palace of Akanishta is the essence of all Buddhas of the 3 times who shows me directly my mind is Dharmakaya. I prostrate to the glorious exalted Gurus. Please bless me and all sentient beings that our minds become the Dharma. Please bless us that the Dharma becomes the path. Please bless us that the path dispels confusion. Please bless us that confusion arise as wisdom. And now please think to yourself that we are listening to the Dharma this morning in order to bring all of our mothers, all sentient beings throughout space, to the state of completely perfect Buddhahood, the state of lasting happiness. And so please listen with this motivation of bodhicitta this morning. And the Dharma that we are listening to is the Treasury of Abhidharma by Vasubandhu, as explained by the 9th Karmapa Wangchuk Dorje in his commentary entitled Youthful Play. Of the 8 chapters of the Treasury of Abhidharma, we are discussing the 5th, the teachings on the kernels, which teach the subtle afflictions that then grow and can develop into actual strong afflictions that can motivate us into actions that will perpetuate existence. And so this teaching, this chapter has 3 main parts. And the first part of these is teaching the nature of the kernels. The second is what discards the kernels. And the third is the results of discarding the kernels. So the three sections. So the first is talking about the kernels. The kernels themselves are the truth of the origin. What are the origin of suffering? And then the results are the truth of cessation. So we're talking about the first of these sections, the nature of the kernels. And this has two topics. Teaching the kernels is the root of existence. That is saying the root of existence is the kernels, as it says in the very first line. So that first section is very short. And then the second part is understanding the nature of the kernels, understanding the kernels. And so the understanding the kernels has three main sections. There's the classifications of the kernels, how the kernels arise, and the enumerations of the kernels. So the classifications of the kernels are one way. When you take a look at the kernels, afflictions, it's not just like there's one affliction or a few afflictions. There are many ways to divide it into many subtler and smaller and subtler distinctions. And by making these distinctions, we can get more understanding about what the natures of the kernels are. And so that's why we engage in the distinctions. So this section on the classifications of the kernel says three parts: the classifications of the essence, the classifications of the aspects, and then the classification, the classifications of what has the kernel. So what possesses kernels. So of these three, we've completed the first, and we're now talking about the second, the classification of the aspects. So in the classification of the aspects, we have five main parts. The classification of universal or not. This is what we spoke about on Sunday. The distinctions of focusing on the undefiled or not. We also spoke about that on Sunday. Developing by concurrence and by focus. Classification as non-virtuous and neutral, and what kernels tie one down in the three times. So here we're on the section on the classification of the kernels as virtuous and non-virtuous. And this is on page 401 of the book. So when we think about the kernels as virtuous and unvirtuous, or neutral and unvirtuous, we have these three general categories. We've got virtuous, neutral, and unvirtuous. And before I talk about the text, in English, often people translate what I translate as afflictions, they translate it as negative emotions. And so there are two important points here that we have to remember, and I kind of harp on these a lot, so maybe you've heard me say this before, but I'm going to say it again. When we talk about the afflictions, they are not necessarily negative, and they're not necessarily emotions. When you think about it, okay, what is something that's negative? Negative something that's bad. Well, actually, there are some afflictions that can be neutral. They can't be virtuous. They can be neutral, as in, for example, sometimes the idea of having a personal soul will motivate, for example, with Christians, having the idea of an eternal soul, which is an affliction because it's two afflictions. It's extreme view because it's holding on to eternalism, and it's also the view of personality because it's holding on to a self. It's those two, but it can motivate people to do virtuous things. So it's not necessarily negative. So it's neutral. Those two are neutral, as we'll get into in a moment. Some of them are just completely negative: anger, desire, pride. And pride is actually also, desire is not necessarily negative either. Anger is definitely negative. Really, I think anger is probably the only one. Well, actually, no, we'll get into that. So they're not necessarily negative. That's the first problem with saying that the afflictions are negative emotions, because they're not necessarily negative. Then the second thing is they aren't necessarily emotions. Is the view of a self, is that an emotion? Not in our normal way that we speak about emotions. Now, these days, I think a lot of Americans in particular, and since I'm an American, I can say this, we Americans really like our emotions. And we often have a very expansive idea of what an emotion is. I, in fact, read one book where it said that thirst was an emotion. And that was a new one to me. I've never thought of thirst as an emotion. So there are emotions, so when we think about it, manifest anger is an emotion, right? Ignorance is not an emotion, not usually, because it doesn't, an emotion in the way we regularly speak, an emotion is something that motivates you to act. It makes you feel and makes you want to do something. In fact, if you look at the dictionary definition of it, it says it's a strong feeling that makes you want to do something, essentially. So that's what we mean by an emotion in regular English parlance. But it's not necessarily what we mean here. Ignorance is not really an emotion. Doubt might be, but it usually isn't. The 5 views are not really emotions. So afflictions and emotions are like their 4 categories. There are also emotions that are not afflictions. Love, compassion. Faith can have a strong and emotional component, right? So emotions and afflictions are different. And in English, because I think people are translating want to use the words that people understand, and you say, in English, everyone is going to have a reaction, is going to get some sort of an understanding out of the word emotion, so we use the words emotions, but are we getting the right understanding? So that's an important point that we need to think about. So the emotions and the afflictions are different things. The afflictions are not necessarily negative. So this is why I use the word affliction, which is, I mean, I suppose I could use the Sanskrit word klesha. That's also another reasonable, but I think that the word affliction gives you more sense of what it is, because they're like illnesses that cause pain for you. They afflict you, they bring you pain. And so that's the literal meaning of the word affliction. And then it also gives us the opportunity of saying afflictions, afflicted, afflicting. You've got different forms in English that you can use. So it's kind of a more flexible word in that way that also reflects some of the different words. Because in Sanskrit, you have like klesha and klishta, aklishta, and various different forms of the word. So these are all things that we can just keep in mind. So basically, this is the reason why I'm a little bit more technical in my language here, and even when I'm teaching on generals, because we don't want to give people the wrong ideas about what emotions are. Emotions are not bad. They're not good, they're not bad, they're just feelings. And afflictions are not necessarily negative. They can be neutral, but on the scale of things, we'd have to say they're not really that good. Okay, so now after all of that, we can get into the text. And so here we are at the top of page 401 in the book. And so we're talking about the classification of the kernels as non-virtuous and neutral. In other words, when we talk about the kernels, we can say that they are non-virtuous, or we can say that they're neutral. They're going to be one of the two. They're not going to be virtuous. So which kernels are virtuous, or excuse me, which kernels are non-virtuous and which ones are neutral? So there are 3 topics here. There's the actual, the specifics of the roots, and an elaboration. So the actual is saying, well, okay, really, which ones are neutral, which ones are non-virtuous? So here it goes. In verse 19, it reads, in higher all neutral, in desire, the personality, extreme, and simultaneous ignorance. The rest here are non-virtuous. So in higher, so in the 2 higher realms of form and formless, all the afflictions are neutral. This is because there's no non-virtue in the form or formless realms. People are focused inwards on meditation. They're the beings that are focused inward on meditation. They're not doing unvirtuous things. But they do have afflictions. They have what, as we know from the classifying in the 98, that in the higher realms, they also have the desire, ignorance, doubt, pride, and the views, and so forth. They have all 10 except for, or they have 9 of the 10 except for anger. So there's no anger in the higher realms, but there are forms of all the rest. right? So in the higher, all the afflictions, in the higher realms, form and formless, all the afflictions are neutral. And in desire, personality, personality view, extreme view, and simultaneous ignorance are neutral. So those two views, the personality and extreme views, are neutral, and simultaneous ignorance are neutral. So simultaneous ignorance is the ignorance that is concurrent with the two views of personality and extreme views. The rest here are non-virtuous. So the other three views, wrong view is always non-virtuous. The views of overestimating your view or overestimating discipline and austerity are not necessarily non-virtuous. And desire in the desire realm, anger, desire, unmixed ignorance, and or ignorance that's concurrent with something other than those two views, etc. Those are all non-virtuous. So how many of the kernels are non-virtuous, Wangchuk Dorje says. How many are neutral, you ask? So the kernels that arise in the higher form and formless realms are all neutral, because the full ripening of afflicted dharmas is suffering, and that is in neither of those two, as there is no cause for harming another. So if it were unvirtuous, then it's going to ripen as pain, but there is nothing like that in the form or formless realm. Therefore, there are no unvirtuous here. So here, Wangchuk Dorje does say afflicted, and maybe we have to look at, maybe it should be non-virtuous, because actually the afflictions, the kernels there are still afflicted. They're just not unvirtuous. So the full ripening of unvirtuous dharmas is suffering. So that's not in those two realms. So in desire, we have the two views, the view of personality and the view of holding extremes, and also simultaneous ignorance, which means ignorance concurrent with them, the two views of personality and holding extremes, are neutral. And why are they neutral? It's because they're not exclusive of generosity and other such virtuous dharmas, as in the example I gave of the good Christian who practices generosity, the good Muslim who practices generosity, or whichever other religion, whoever has a view of a permanent soul, but still takes that as a good reason to be generous, it doesn't prevent that. So if it were an unvirtuous dharma, then it could only produce unvirtuous actions. So because it can produce either virtuous or unvirtuous or neutral actions, therefore it is considered they are considered neutral. And the other reason that they are considered neutral is that they look inward, so they are unable to motivate harmful action. So when you're thinking about personality view or extreme view, the eternalism, the idea that you have a soul, and the idea that soul or self is permanent, you're looking in. When you're looking at your five aggregates and seeing a me and making an idea of that, that is looking inwards. So that is not going to directly motivate any action. When you're actually doing harmful conduct, you actually have to have something that's looking outward at other sentient beings. And so those are mainly discards of meditation, not the extreme or the personality view. So the rest, the kernel, other than those three here in desire realm, are non-virtuous. So that's your desire, anger, many types of ignorance, but not except for that simultaneous, the doubt, pride, and the other three views. Okay, then we have the specifics of the roots, because at the same time we talk about, well, which ones? We talk about them, the afflictions as being, what do we say? The afflictions as being, sometimes we're talking about those like the roots of non-virtue, and we always talk about the three roots of non-virtue, right? So this is or sometimes we talk about 5 or 6 roots. So when we talk about the roots, well, what do we mean by roots of non-virtue, and what are roots of non-virtue? So here, there are 2 topics here, and the specifics of the roots has 2 topics, the roots of non-virtue and the roots of the neutral. So the roots of non-virtue, these are the ones that we're pretty familiar with. Desire, aversion, and delusion. In desire are the roots of non-virtue. Actually, as I was looking at this the other day, I realized that this probably could all be in the plural, Desires, aversions, and delusions in desire are roots of non-virtue. So what we mean is all the different types of desire that you have in the desire realm, all the different types of aversion or anger or hatred are roots of non-virtue, and the delusions are all roots of non-virtue. Why are they roots of non-virtue? It's because they are non-virtuous themselves, and they're also the basis for unvirtuous actions. It's like Nagarjuna said, greed, hatred, what is it? Greed, hatred, and delusion, what the acts these motivate are non-virtues. And I'm getting the quote, I had a better translation once and I've forgotten, and I'm remembering the Tibetan. But at any rate, anything that's motivated by greed, hatred, or delusion, or as put here, desire, aversion, and delusion, is in the desire realm necessarily unvirtuous. So how many of them, how many of the kernels are roots of non-virtue? How many are not? So all the desires in the desire realm, that means the desire that is all the discards of seeing, the 4 types of discards of seeing, suffering, origin, cessation, and path, plus those that are discards of meditation, all 5 of those types of desire are roots of non-virtue. Similarly with all the aversions, all the 5 types of aversion, the 4 types of discards of seeing, and the discards of meditation, those 5 classes are all non-virtues. And delusions, similarly, those same 5 classes in the desire realm, except for the delusion that's concurrent with personality view and extreme view, these are the roots of non-virtue, right? So that in order to be the root of non-virtue, it means that they have to be both non-virtues and the roots, also the roots of non-virtue are agreed to be roots of non-virtue. Now this sentence is actually taken almost directly out of the auto commentary. And when you look at it in English, it looks maybe a little bit like a bit of a, what is it, tautology or something. What it means is that they have to be non-virtuous, and they have to be the basis or the foundation, the roots of non-virtuous actions. And then we can say that they are the roots of non-virtue. So the remaining kernels of doubt and pride are non-virtuous, but they are not the roots of non-virtue. The reason why they're not, this is described in a little bit later, but basically it's because doubt is you're not exactly sure what's going on. It's not stable. Something's going to be the root of something. You need to have something that's kind of stable, just in terms of the common parlance of the word root, and here the word root in Sanskrit mula or in Tibetan sawa means like the basis or the foundation for the action. And so if you want to have that root, it's got to be something stable. And doubt, because it's like kind of going, I don't know, it's kind of maybe it is, maybe it isn't, sort of going, it's not stable, so it's not really, doesn't function as a root. And also the pride is sort of looking at things on kind of a high level. It's not a root because it's kind of looking at things on a high level. So we'll go over that again in just a moment. But that's the reason why they're not considered roots of non-virtue here. So those are the 3 roots of non-virtues. And actually, again, we say 3 roots of non-virtues, but actually you can break it down into categories and say that there are a bunch of different types of non-virtues. So we have the roots of non-virtue, but there are also the roots of the neutral, the roots of neutral action. So what are those? Well, there are 2 different traditions. There's the Kashmiri tradition, and then there is the Bahyaka or the Aparantaka tradition. So in the Kashmiri tradition, they say there are 3 roots of neutral: craving and ignorance, intelligence. Others act dually, loftily, so they are not. So the 3 roots of neutral are craving, and particularly the craving in the higher realms of form and formless. So this is the neutral craving in the form and formless. It can't be the craving in the desire realm because that is necessarily unvirtuous, right? And ignorance, this is the ignorance of the delusions of the form and formless realms. And the intelligence or full knowing, again here, I don't know if I mentioned it yet this year. When you see the word full knowing, think prajna. This is the ability to distinguish, what do we say? The ability to distinguish what is dharma from what is not dharma, from what is right, what is wrong, and so forth. That's what we mean by prajna, or intelligence. So this intelligence can be the type of intelligence that arises from full ripening, such as that is present at the moment of birth, the moment of whichever the four modes of birth, whether from womb or from egg or moisture or miraculously. There is intelligence present at that point. But there is also somewhat neutral intelligence that is kind of like functioned as the root of the neutral. So the root of the neutral is the basis of the neutral. And what is neutral? It's the form and formless realms here. So others act dually and loftily, so they are not. So others, the other kernels, doubt and pride, which are other than those kernels, that's why it says other, act in doubt's case dually and unstably. Because it's unstable, it cannot be a root. It can't be a basis of anything. The root has to be stable. And in pride's case, loftily. It's kind of looking at things. It's not looking down at the basis. It's looking up and getting full and inflated of yourself. So they do not deserve to be called roots, according to the Kashmiri. This is a point that some people perhaps disagree with as you look at the commentaries you see. It seems that Vasubandhu might have been a bit skeptical of that one too. In common parlance, roots are said to be things that are stable and underneath. So they, doubt and pride, are not roots because they're dissimilar to roots. They're not stable and they're not underneath. And here at the end it says, it is said, this is again quoting from the auto commentary. And so Vasubandhu is saying, they say that, but it's what was called in Tibetan a skeptical word, or not slightly looking down. It's like not being too impolite, but saying, I don't buy it. It's not really. So that's the Kashmiri tradition. Then there's another tradition is the Aparantaka tradition, or the Bhayaka tradition. And as explained in the, actually this is one good thing if you look at the Chimjamyang, the translation of the ornament of Abhidharma by Chimjambayang, that has a nice explanation of the meaning of the word Aparantaka. The Aparantaka, which basically means all those in other places, is a word for the Sarvastivada schools other than the Kashmiri. Or Bahyaka means like the outsiders. So the ones who are other than the Kashmiris. So you've got the Kashmiris and everyone else. And everyone else is called the Aparantakas. So there's some differences between the Kashmiri had its own specific positions in some ways. And so this is distinguishing between these two. So the Bahyaka or Aparantakas propose these four: craving, view, pride, delusion. From ignorance, 3 jhanas. So these are 4 roots of the neutral, they say. Craving, and again, this is the craving of the form and formless realm. Views, the views on those levels, pride and delusion. So what is the reason? It's because of the power of ignorance, which is just another word for delusion. There are the 3 meditators of jhana. In other words, the craving, views, and pride lead to meditating on jhana. And these meditators on jhana have excessive craving, view, and pride. And so that is their position. Those are these 4 roots of the neutral, because they produce these different types of meditators who then also have excessive craving, view, and pride. Now, excessive craving, you might think of it as something like the dogs who are slobbering when they see that bone, or someone who is salivating seeing a chocolate cake or whatever else, and think that's what you mean by excessive craving. Here, it's the craving of the form and formless realm. So they're very attached to that. So it's not necessarily, when you see the words in English, excessive craving, you think it's just someone who's just like, but it's not necessarily that. So the craving, view, and pride. So here we come to a very interesting point. And this comes up, it says an elaboration here is the topic. And the reason for this elaboration is that in Sanskrit, and then also in Tibetan, the word that we commonly translate as neutral in English really means lungdumaten, or vyavakrita, means not showing a direction, not definitely going one way or the other. Lungdumaten in Tibetan is like saying not definite, What is it he said here? Undeclared is the way that Ian Coughlin translated it in his Ornament of Abhidharma. So it's like saying it's like not saying, it's like holding its cards and not saying which way it's going. That's the literal, one of the meanings of the word. And so for that reason, there is a little bit of an overlap that we don't have in English, because we don't use the word neutral in the same way in English. So in English, we would probably say neutral for the one and indefinite for the other. But in Sanskrit and Tibetan, these meanings overlap in one word. And so, so this question comes about and say, well, we say that there are these words that are either neutral or indefinite. Well, is this the same? Because we have the teachings in the sutras about the 14 different indefinite or unanswered questions. So what is it? Is this the same thing? Is that why those questions are called indefinite, because they're neutral? And so the answer to that is no, that's not why they're called that indefinite or neutral question. The reason why they're called indefinite or neutral is because that indicates the type of response, an indefinite or declining to respond, basically. That's why they're called the indefinite. And so these 14 questions are like, if someone comes and asks you, says, well, what about, we've got the self and the world. Are they permanent or are they impermanent? Are they both permanent and impermanent? Are they neither? So that's 4 questions, right, about the self and the world. And the second is, do the self and the world have a limit? Or do they not have a limit? Do they both have a limit and not have a limit? Or do they neither have a limit nor not have a limit? So that's a 4. And then the question is about, what is the mode of birth? Are they born from moisture or from the womb and so forth? Or are they not born from moisture and so forth? Or both or neither? That's 12. And then another question is the body life force, and is the life force the body? Or is the life force one thing and the body something else? So why are these questions called neutral or indefinite? And the reason that they are called this way is because they're actually answers where you answer them by not answering them. So what is this saying? And this is what comes up in the next stanza. I'm going to resize this just a little bit and see if I can get that all. Oh yeah, here we are. So here we have the verse 22, categorical distinguishing and questioning and the declining, responsors answer queries on responses answer queries on death, rebirth, superior, or self, or other. So here's in the commentary, what are the 14 neutral indeterminate dharmas mentioned in scriptures? These are the 14 that I just read to you. They are questions whose answer was not actually indicated, so they're called neutral or indeterminate, right? So it's like not giving a definite response. So here the elaboration on this is to say that actually there are 4 different ways you can answer a question. You can give a categorical response. You can give a distinguishing response. You can respond with a question, the questioning response, and then the declining response. These are the 4 ways to answer queries. So the first is like saying, will all beings die? Or will all sentient beings die? There are different ways this is phrased in different commentaries. Will all sentient beings die? Will all beings die? The answer is yes, all sentient beings will die. They will die. So that is a categorical response. It's like, definitely. That's definitely going to happen. You can just say, someone says, are all beings going to die? And you can just say, yes. You don't have to worry about anything else because that's just the way it is. So the second is a distinguishing response. The distinguishing response is like when you're asked, will all who die be reborn? So here you actually you can't just say everyone who's going to die is going to be reborn, because arhats are not going to be reborn when they die. So you have to give a response that makes the distinction and saying, okay, those who have not extinguished the afflictions will be reborn. That means ordinary sentient beings, like ordinary sentient beings and nobles all the way up to the non-returners, they will be reborn. But those who have extinguished the afflictions will not take rebirth. They will not be reborn. So here it's like some questions you have to say, well, wait a minute. I can't just say yes or no. There are some who will and some who won't. So you have to kind of distinguish the two when you make the response. And so then the third is like saying, is this person inferior or superior? Which are they? Well, the question is inferior or superior to what? So you can't really, from the question, you can't really say, you can't even give a distinguishing response. So you have to say, well, in whom? In relation to whom? In relation to the gods, they're inferior. In relation to the lower realms, they're superior. So you've got a human, you've got, I don't know, what do we call it? We have Tashi. Tashi, just a regular Joe in American English, a regular Tashi. Nothing special, but in relation to the gods, definitely inferior. In relation to a dog or another animal in the lower realms, superior, right? So you have to say. So then the fourth type of question is the declining response, where you actually decline to respond. And this is like when you are asked, is the self other than the aggregates or not? How can you respond to that question? Is the self other than the aggregates or not? You can't really say anything about that question because you can't determine whether the self is the same as or different from anything, because the self doesn't exist. It's like you want to say, okay, are rabbit horns and turtle fur the same or different? How can you say the rabbit horns and turtle fur are the same or different? Neither exists. If you're going to say something is the same or that it's different, you have to be able to kind of look at them and say, okay, these are their characteristics. This is what they're like, right? So if you can't evaluate it, or you can say, is a rabbit horn different from a cow's horn? You can't say that because there is no rabbit horn to evaluate. You have no way of saying is it the same or different? No way to say it. So that's what these questions are like. Is the self other than the aggregates or not? So often there are stories in the, not necessarily often, there are stories in the sutras of people going and asking the Buddha the questions, such as the 14 questions that I mentioned before. A Brahmin came and asked the Buddha these questions, and he just sat there. So the Ian Coughlin translates this instead of as declining responses, and as he translated as just staying silent, remaining silent. You just can't say anything. So when you're saying, is the self other than aggregates or not, this is asking about non-existent attributes, like whether the child of a childless woman is blue or white. So it is something to be put aside only. So the 14 determinants are similar. So these are the ones I just mentioned a few moments ago about, are the self and the world, permanent, impermanent, and so forth. So those are the roots of the roots of non-virtue and the roots of the neutrals, and then also the indeterminate questions. The important thing about this one of the indeterminate questions is, like, when you are actually talking with people about the Dharma, you have to think about these. Is this a question I should answer or not? What type of answer can I give? So you have to think about things carefully when you are responding to questions. Is this answer going to be one that I can? If someone asks you, well, what is the nature of the soul? What can you say? It's hard to tell. Or is the soul different from the body? This is the question, so you have to be careful about what you're going to say. So when you think about this, it gives you an idea when you're talking with people about the Dharma. How do you respond to their questions? Some questions are easy, like, is everyone going to die? Are all composite phenomena impermanent? Easy, it's yes. If someone says, is everything impermanent? That's a little bit more difficult to answer, because then you might have to distinguish, because they have, like, space. Space is not impermanent. and so forth. So there are these different ways of thinking about these. So it's good to consider these questions. It's kind of an aside in the topic of the chapter that comes out mainly because of just a feature of Sanskrit, a linguistic feature of Sanskrit that then was carried over in the Tibetan translations. So now we have the next section, which kernels tie one down in the 3 times. And this is a very interesting section for a few different reasons. The first is just on a practical level. It's like thinking about, well, what ties us down in the 3 times? What binds us? Why are we in samsara? So this is one thing that we're talking about. How is it the kernels tie you down to the thing in the 3 times? And then also another such aspect that comes out is, well, what is the nature of the times? Do the times exist, and so forth? So those are all very interesting questions, and there's a lot in this topic. There are 4 topics: the things to which one is tied, examining the 3 times, and then the kernels that are discarded but still possessed. And then the 4th is what dharmas are the objects of which cognitions. So the first part of this is the things to which one is tied, and there are 2 topics here: how the specific afflictions bind and how the general afflictions bind. So when we look at these 2 topics, there are 2 different types of afflictions that are listed here. Yet another way to classify the afflictions, as if you didn't have enough ways already with 98 afflictions. We get another way of looking at them. The specific afflictions and general afflictions, these are 2 ways of categorizing. So specific afflictions are afflictions that are toward a specific object. General afflictions are afflictions that are general and can be towards any sort of object. Desire, for example, desire is desire for attractive or pleasing objects. And then you have another with doubt. Can be doubt. You can doubt just about anything. You can, so they are different in that level. Doubt and pride, or no, pride is also specific. Doubt and ignorance are delusion, are general, but anger and so forth. Things like when you have a specific, when you have an object that you're specifically attached, when the affliction is toward a specific object, such as desire is specifically for pleasurable things. Aversion or hatred or anger, whichever you translate it as, or whichever word they use in Sanskrit, is for an unpleasant or an unattractive object. So these have specific things that they are looking at. Pride is generally towards your own qualities as you perceive them. So it's specific. Other afflictions are general. So that's the difference. Specific afflictions have specific objects. General afflictions they're kind of like they go for anything. So how do the specific afflictions bind? And this has 2 points. So how they bind in the past and present, and how they bind in the future. These are the 2 points. One is tied down to things toward which desire and anger, pride as well, of both the past and present have arisen but not been abandoned. So one is tied down to anything that is an object. So there's an object there. And that thing is something toward which desire, anger, or pride can arise. For example, if it is an attractive object, a pleasing object, then you'll feel desire. If it is anger, then it is going to be an unattractive object. And if it is the 5 aggregates of your own being, then pride is going to be focused on those, right? And this is of both the past and present have arisen but not yet been abandoned. So in the present, this is easy. You see that piece of 90% cocoa solids chocolate, and you feel desire for it. That desire is tying you down towards that present object, right? Or you think about in the past, you had desire for that chocolate oblivion truffle torte. This was 25 years ago, one of my favorite recipes. I haven't baked for years, but there's chocolate oblivion truffle torte. And you think about that and you feel desire, and that's tying you down to the past. It's a past object. You're tied down to it still. You still got attachment to it. That desire has arisen. 25 years ago, I made that chocolate oblivion truffle torte enough times that I still remember the name. And I'm still tied down to it. Right? So that has arisen. And I have not given it up because I'm still tied down. And I think, oh, that's a pretty good cake. Right? So that's arisen but not been defiled. Or if I think about the torts in Vienna or in Budapest, yeah, just, okay. So those things are things of the past, for me at least. I mean, they're present torts in Vienna, of course, but they're not in my, I don't know about them. The ones in the past I remember, right? So you are tied down to them because they're specific afflictions. You've got that specific desire towards that thing of the past or that thing of the present that's tying you down. You're tied down to those specific things. Now, that's kind of a minor, kind of, in some ways, a silly example. There are other things that we can still feel, that we can still recognize. But I think for food, it's easy to see this. I mean, sometimes you have an experience of eating something and you remember it long after and say, oh, that was so good. You're tied down to that, right? And anger is another one. You got really angry at someone and you still haven't let go of it, right? It's the same. So, for example, it's like when a calf is tied to a stake with a rope. The calf can't go anywhere. The calf cannot leave the area where it's tied. So, you've got that affliction is the rope that's tying you down to that stake, and you can't get away from it. So that's how you were bound in the past and present. So how they bind in the future. The future mental bind to all. The others tie in their own time, the non-arising to all times. So the future, you have future afflictions too, your future desire, anger, and pride that are associated with the mental. That's why it says the future mental. Let me see if I can resize this window and get that whole verse on one line. Yes. The future mental tie to all. So the future mental, so the future desire, anger, and pride associated with the mental consciousness that has arisen but not have abandoned. So in other words, they will arise in the future, but you haven't abandoned them. They tie you to all things of all three times because all three times are the object of the mind. So what this is saying is that the future mental objects can think, future mental consciousness can think about the past, present, and future, any of them. And so that way, with the desire, anger, and pride, can tie you down to all things of all three times, because all three times are the object of the mind. So you've got the mental consciousness that can think about the past, present, and future. But when you have the five sensory consciousnesses, they can only be attached to things in their own specific time, because they're non-conceptual consciousnesses, they're thought-free. They can only be tied, they can only interact with things at their own particular time. So when you have like desire in your taste, in your tongue consciousness for that chocolate oblivion torte, that was 25 years ago, longer. I don't know how long it's been since I made that torte. It's been a long time. So that moment back then, that past was tied down to that. Future would be, if I am ever in a position to have chocolate oblivion truffle torte again in the future, that, what do we say? That desire would be attached in that particular time. So the others tie in their own time, as it says in the commentary. Desire and anger that are future arising dharma bases. In other words, they're phenomena that will arrive in the future. You have the five groups of consciousnesses other than the mental, that means the five sensory consciousnesses, that will in the future, will tie you down in their own time, the future. So at the time they arise, when there's something that's there in the future, when there's that chocolate oblivion truffle torte and you feel desire for it in the future, you are tied down in that future time. The desire and anger of the 5 groups of consciousnesses that are non-arising Dharma bases tie one down to things that they focus on in all time. So there are things that non-arising, they are phenomena that haven't yet arisen. And there was a nice translation of this term that Ian Coughlin had. What did he call it? Because this is a term that I've always wondered about. It's not a very clear. It's kind of a literal translation. Yuri Chujin, or non-arising phenomena, non-arising Dharma base. What did he say? Unarisen instances. That's how he puts it. So when you have an unarisen instance, when you say future non-arising dharma, it's an unarisen instance of, like an unarisen instance of desire that could happen in the future, but it hasn't. In the sensory consciousness, ties you down to things they focus on in all 3 times, like flax. So flax here, this is a kind of funny example. This is from Yashomitra's commentary. And the reason is that it's given is that flax, you've got the flax plant. And what is a flax plant focused on doing? It's focused on flowering and producing seeds that will produce a result. So similarly, those future unarisen instances are focused towards producing results, and they focus on all 3 times. So that is the meaning of that. But the main point in this whole thing is thinking about how the afflictions actually tie you down. This is something you can actually look at in yourself. And, I'm using kind of a silly example with chocolate, oblivion, truffle, tort. But you can think about it for yourself and remember, this is just, if you can see it with something stupid, then you can actually also see it with something that's more meaningful, more important. Maybe it's a person. Maybe it's not desire, but maybe it's hatred or anger. You're still tied down to them, right? They still bind you. So understanding how that works is good. Now, understanding how they works is just a step. This is kind of another point in the whole discussion. When we're talking about understanding the natures of the afflictions, when we're talking about understanding the nature of the afflictions, we're going through a lot of technical philosophical detail here. This is not the same, and it's good to have that understanding, but it's not necessarily exactly how to overcome them in ourselves. This is not directly doing that. Instead, what we're doing now is we're gaining an understanding of how the afflictions work, how they tie us down, how they keep us attached, whether it's an attachment of craving or it's an attachment of aversion, whatever sort of attachment is, how is it that works? So that then when we go to apply, when we learn what the practices or the antidotes for those, we can have a better idea of what we're doing. But what we're speaking about now is not directly saying this is an antidote. It's good to understand and to look and to see in yourself. Is this how it is? Am I still, and I think it's easy to see this with the past. For me, it's easy to see this with the past. When you're thinking about those grudges you're holding on to from years ago, or the memories of pleasurable things that you still would like to have more of. That's an easy way to see how you are still attached to the things, how those things are tying you down and binding you. Now, how are you going to deal with that attachment? That's a different matter. In particular, like with anger, everyone is always very interested in anger. What we're doing now, we're talking about the natures, the different types, the different classes, thinking about how it arises, what the aspects are. But this isn't directly giving you the antidotes yet. To a certain degree, the antidotes come up in the 6th chapter and in the other chapters. I mean, this is all of this is teaching, and the teachings are given in order to help us overcome the afflictions, but they're not specific practices that we're going to do. There are a couple of reasons for that. The first is that we are going through the view. We're trying to establish the understanding. And when you have that understanding, then when you do the practice, then actually being able to apply it effectively is going to be easier. So it's important to have the understanding first. It's like, as the example they always give in the Tibetan tradition, it's like trying to climb a cliff if you have no arms. No view, you can't do it. So you need the arms of the view to be able to climb up the cliff, right? The second thing, the second aspect is actually that treatises like this often don't teach the specific techniques for meditation. The philosophical treatises are actually very spare. They're not instruction manuals on meditation. And there's a good reason for this. And the reason is that people might read the instructions and think they can do the meditation just from reading the instructions. And you can do a certain amount, but it's not certain how effective it's going to be. There's a story in the Vinaya of a monk who was a new monk, a new bhikshu came, and he started memorizing all the sutras. And so he started memorizing a sutra, and there was a sutra that gave instructions on how to do dhyana meditation. And he thought to himself, oh, this is great. He learned the instructions, and without really talking to anyone else, he went off into a hut, and he practiced and he achieved the dhyana meditations. Now, you might think this is good. Not necessarily. He died. And when he died, he was reborn in the form realm, but he hadn't achieved the state of a noble being because he had not had all the instructions. He had just had the equivalent of the written instructions. He hadn't actually had someone who was actually guiding him through the practice. How do you do the practice? How do you actually do it? What is the main point of doing the dhyana meditations? And because he didn't understand that, when he died, he was reborn in the form realm, which in the short term is a good thing, but in the long term is actually quite bad. You have an incredibly long lifetime, and if you don't have the proper view and haven't made the proper aspirations, there's the danger that you're going to finish that lifetime and end up in some horrible lower realm. So the Buddha at that point instructed the monks not to write down or not to record the instructions like that. Instead, those are to be the instructions on meditation, even from the time of the Buddha, were to be given, from a student, from an experienced meditator, a bhikshu or bhikshuni or whoever, to a certain disciple. And they're passed down in that way. We still see this in the Tibetan tradition, where you have the philosophical tradition and then the lineage of pith instructions that's passed down. And actually the lineage of pith instructions, we've got a lot of those that are written down, and most of us think that we can just read them and understand them. Actually, we have to be careful when we're looking at the pith instructions, because they're very easy to understand. And the other thing is that when we see the writings of the pith instructions in the Tibetan tradition, we also have to be aware that, for one thing, they're often written as kind of guides for the teacher, not for the student, like Wanchuk Dorje's three treatises, the pointing out the Dharmakaya and eliminating the darkness of ignorance, and the Ocean of definitive meaning. These three are actually written for the guru, for the master, for the retreat master who's bringing disciples through the process. And the other thing you have to remember is that they actually often leave out the best instructions, the ones that were really most helpful. So if you just take a look at those and read those instructions on your own, they're purposely not complete. And so this is just the point that we have to keep in mind. It's important to remember the difference between what we're doing. So it's important for us to gain this understanding now. When we have this understanding, that will be helpful for us in the future when we actually come to do the meditation. When we do the meditation, it's best to have some level of personal guidance. Of course, that level of personal guidance is not always so easy to get. Okay, that was my digression for the day, or one of my digressions for the day. So we've spoken about the specific afflictions, and now to talk about the general afflictions. So the general afflictions are the ones that aren't necessarily for specific objects. They can be towards just about anything. So all that remain tie one to all. So all the afflictions that remain, which are the general afflictions, remain. They tie one, that is, they tie ourselves to all phenomena of all three times. So as long as they have not been discarded, all that remain, that is the view, doubt, and ignorance of the three times, the past, present, and future, tie one to things that are objects into the focus of all three times in all five classes. So they tie one to all phenomena that are objects of focus, and anything that you can, basically anything you can observe or think about in the three times, past, present, and future, in all five classes. When you see five classes, you have to remember the five classes of discards. Discards of seeing suffering, discards of seeing origin, discards of seeing cessation, discards of seeing the path, and discards of meditation. These are the five classes of discard. And the reason why they tie you to all of these is because they're general afflictions, as they're tied to all 5 aggregates. So they bind to all 5 aggregates. They can look at anything. For example, what are we talking about? We're talking about view, doubt, and ignorance in the 3 times. Ignorance is not specific towards things that are attractive or unattractive, the way desire and anger are. Ignorance can be for things that are attractive. You can be ignorant of things that are attractive. You can be ignorant of things that are unattractive. You can be ignorant of things that are neither attractive nor unattractive. And you can be ignorant of things in all 3 times. They're not specific. For example, we can look back in our past and we can see chocolate oblivion truffle torte and still feel the attachment to that because it's specific. With your ignorance, at the same time, the last time I made chocolate oblivion truffle torte, I had plenty of ignorance. I must have, but I don't remember it. And, it's kind of not specific towards any one thing. At the same time as I was ignorant towards chocolate oblivion truffle torte, I was ignorant towards many other things at the same time. It's not specific the way that is, right? So like desire, you can remember what you're desiring about. When you're ignorant of something, you don't even remember what you're ignorant of because you just don't even know what it is. So actually ignorance is a really interesting affliction. And doubt, you can doubt anything, and it's kind of amorphous, and so it's hard to say. It's general. So they tie you to things in all 3 times. So here we have a question of, well, what do we mean by the 3 times? And it's easy to just say past, present, and future. But what are they? So this is the question. So examining the 3 times, and it has presenting the position of this school, that means the Kashmiri Vaibhashka or Sarvastivada school, and then rebutting criticism. So the position of this school has 3 topics. The position that all 3 times exist substantially. The second part is presenting the proof, and third is teaching that this is the tradition of the great exposition. So here, before I get into the text, just to remind those of you who were in the first year's class, and to, let all of you know who weren't. When we think about the times, what are the times? The times are the 5 aggregates, as it says. Just these are times, the basis for talk and so forth, it says back in the first chapter. So when you think about time in the Abhidharma, it's not something like, these days we have this kind of Newtonian idea of time as time being something separate from everything else. You've got time and then things happen. You've got this time, you've got one moment follows the next. You've got moment 0 followed by moment 1 and so forth. And it's like this universal time that goes everywhere, and kind of a Newtonian idea. It's separate from everything else. But for the Abhidharma, time is not separate. Actually, time is the 5 aggregates. The 5 aggregates that have arisen and perished are the past. Those that have not yet arisen are the future. Those that have arisen and are perishing, the ones in this microscopic moment, those are the present aggregates. There is no time separate from those. I mean, you can have an idea of some universal timeline started by Mr. Newton or whoever it is, some idea of some separate time, but you can't actually find it. So it's basically, when you say the past, what is the past? It's the 5 aggregates that have already perished. What is the future? The 5 aggregates that haven't arisen. The present are those aggregates that are rising and perishing in this very moment, or rising, staying, and perishing, if you want to be more specific. They're kind of arising, staying, and perishing all at the same time. So you've got this, that very short present and the long past. So that's what we're talking about the time. So when we say, do the times exist substantially, what we're saying is, do phenomena from the past exist substantially? Do phenomena from the future exist substantially? kind of seems to us like the phenomena from the present exist substantially, right? We can sort of see we've got our bodies and everything. They seem like they're there, right? That's present. Well, what about the past? What about the future? So the position that all three times exist substantially, we've got the Great Exposition School. Now, the Great Exposition is another name for the Sarvastivada, or it's a subset of the Sarvastivada, is another way of putting it. And their position is the times always exist. So that means that the past phenomena, when something has gone into the past, that phenomena still has some sort of a substantial existence. Future phenomena have some sort of a substantial existence. Now, when we first think about it, this seems like, oh no, that couldn't be. How can that be? It just seems like, no way. But if you got to think about it actually a little bit. And actually there is a sutra that's quoted in the Abhidharma, there's a sutra that's quoted in the a sutra quoted in the auto commentary that talks about this. It says, I've got too many windows open, I can't look at it, but basically it's saying that the Buddha said to the monks, you must remember that dharmas of the past still exist. Dharmas of the futures exist. If they did not exist, how could you perceive them? That's the basic thing. If they did not exist, how could they produce results? You have to remember that we're dealing with a realist school here. The Great Exposition School is saying that the five aggregates, that is the particles of form, the moments of time, exist substantially. When you say that they exist substantially, then you say that if something, and the reason they exist substantially is we can perceive them. Well, there are beings who can perceive the past, people with clairvoyance, such as the Buddha. They're beings who can perceive the future. And if we're saying that they're perceiving the future and so forth, and that their cognition or their wisdom that perceives the future is valid, then that future would have to exist. That past would have to exist. Otherwise, it would be just the same as, seeing a rabbit horn. There'd be no difference. So this is why it's because they're a realist school. And when you're in a realist school, it creates a lot of logical problems for you. Realism is very difficult to defend. But that's the main point we're coming from. So they say that they have to exist because otherwise you couldn't produce them. They wouldn't be able to produce a result in the future. You've done something in a past life, and then in the future, it's going to produce a result. Well, if it doesn't still exist in some way, how can it produce a result? So now the result, the way it works, this is kind of a different question. How it works is difficult, but that's the point. So it's not as simple a question as you initially think. I mean, you initially think, no way, this is just stupid. Everything that's past is gone and done. We read about this all the time. It's not as easy as that. And actually, this is a topic that when you study it in Shedras, in Kaji Shedras, you debate it a little bit. If you go to a Galup monastery and study this, you'll spend a long time debating this topic because there's a lot of really difficult issues that you have to deal with here. So here we are now. So the times always exist. So the commentary on this line says, so at the top of the page that I'm showing now, it says, well, do the past, present, and future composites exist substantially or not? If they exist substantially, that is, the past, present, and future composites exist substantially, then they must be permanent, right? Because it's always there. If not, then you can't be tied to them in the present, you say. For example, like I'm still tied to that Casa Chocolate Oblivion Truffle Torte from 28, I don't know how many years ago, right? So this is the point. This is, now this is actually like, what do we say? Someone making an objection, a straw man making an objection. And so the position of the school is that the times always, at all times, exist. So there's always past, present, and future. And the phenomena in those times always exist. And so here's the proof, and there are 2 points. There's a scriptural proof, and this is said, it was said. Now, who said it? The Buddha said it. The Buddha said it in the sutra, as I just mentioned. And then since there are 2, okay. The 2 means that when you have a consciousness arising, there has to be both the consciousness and the object. So when you are perceiving when you're thinking about the past, when you're perceiving the past, you have to have the object as well as the faculty. So the times exist because it was taught in a sutra, it says. Bhikshus, if there were no past form, the well-versed noble listeners would not view past forms. But because past form exists, the well-versed noble listeners view past form. And similarly, if there were no future form, the well-versed noble listeners would not view future forms. But because future forms exist, the well-versed noble listeners view future form. So they have to exist because because it was taught. The Buddha taught this. He said this. So it was said. Now here, actually, I think in the translation, this is kind of a little bit of an issue we have in translation because we translate things impersonally, when actually it's the Buddha taught this. So if you translate it impersonally, it sounds sort of like, yeah, he said that. No, it's not he said it. It's like the Buddha said this. This is something we have to consider. What did he mean? What was the context? Now, the other reason it was said, that is, the Buddha said that consciousness arises from two, an object and a faculty. So if you're going to have consciousness of the past or future, then you have to have the object or the faculty. Now, consciousness of the past is a little bit different from memory. Memory is not what we're talking about here. We're talking about like perception or inference of the past. Memory is a very different thing. Memory just kind of arises on its own. It's not necessarily valid. But when you have like, in particular, like if you have a clairvoyant perception of the past or the future. So now there's the logical proof of it is that objects exist in result. Now this translation, another thing that I'm seeing as I look through this translation is that as I look through this passage, that this translation, one of the reasons for giving this course is that it gives me a chance to really see what works and doesn't work in this translation. I maybe should have done it before it was published years ago, but now I get an idea. This is not the smoothest. But at any rate, the point is here that the objects exist. The past and future exist in their own time because if the focused object exists, consciousness arises. You can only have consciousness if there's an object for consciousness. But if it does not exist, the consciousness does not arise. For example, the consciousness of, I don't know, chocolate oblivion truffle tort from 28 years ago. That consciousness that cannot be engaged by consciousness if that object doesn't exist, right? But they can be objects of the mind consciousness, so therefore they must exist. Past and future can be objects of the mind consciousness, so therefore they must exist itself. Now here, there's a lot that could be debated in here about, well, then what about a rabbit horn? Because you can make it the object of a mind consciousness, and so this is a difficult question. To say if it is necessary, then the point is that really an object of mind consciousness? And the point is probably not, because they don't exist. Also, because we know there is production by past karma of a later fully ripened result. So therefore, we know the past exists. So because we know that that act of murder that you committed, whether yesterday or 10 years ago, is going to ripen as rebirth in hell, right? So we know that that past object has to exist, because if it doesn't have some sort of existence, the future Dharma can't be produced, because it's real, and it can't just come from nothing. There has to be something real that's going to produce it. So that's why we talk about the two reasons, because of the logical proof. So this is the position of the Great Exposition School. And so the next section describes how that happens. So we've got the three-part. There's the actual part, the divisions of schools, and analyzing which of these four traditions is best. So here it says, because they say these all exist, they're called those who say all exists. So because they, that is the members of the Kashmiri Great Exposition School and other members of the Sarvastivada School, they say that 3 times all exist, they're called, those who say all exists is a translation of the Sanskrit word Sarvastivada. Sarva means all, asti means exist or be, and vada means people who propone or who say, those who say all exist. So that's the name, the reason why the school is called the Sarvastivada. So someone who claims to be a Sarvastivadin must certainly hold this position, it is known. So there were different types of schools that developed in Buddhism. And so we're talking about a particular school called the Sarvastivada school. And this probably developed sometime by the time of the Emperor Ashoka. And it lasted for several hundred years, or was dominant for, very strong for several hundred years. So if you're going to be calling yourself a Sarvastivadin, you have to have this position. This is like kind of the key position of the Sarvastivadin school. Because they say these, the three times, all exist, they are called those who say all exists, or Sarvastivadin. So those who distinguish and say that the present and past karma that has not yet produced a result exist, but the future and the past that have produced a result do not exist, are called Vibhajavadin, those who say there is distinction. So this is kind of a there are some schools, some people say, no, it's crazy to say that everything exists. And then there are also people who say that none of the past and future exists. And this is brought out more in the Chimjamyang school, Abhidharma commentary. You've got three. You've got those, the Sarvastivadin, who say that all times exist substantially always. Then you've got the Vibhajavadin, and the Vibhajavadin, the current Theravada school that has flourished, that went down to Sri Lanka and then spread throughout Southeast Asia, that is actually a Vibhajavadin school. And so the main point is they're distinguishing, well, some exist and some don't exist. Which one exists? Well, the present phenomena exist, and the past karma that haven't yet produced the result exist. But the past phenomena that have already produced the result, they don't exist anymore. And future phenomena don't exist yet. So they're called Vibhajavadin, so those who say there is a distinction. So Vibhaja means like making a distinction. And Vadin, again, is someone who says. So they're basically the ones who are making the distinction. So then there's the question, well, when you say the three times exist, we can actually see that there's kind of a difference between the past and present and future, right? The past is done and has happened and is gone. The present is currently happening, and the future hasn't yet happened. So how do we explain this? And so in the Sarvastivada tradition, there were four different traditions that kind of explained about this. And so these four, and I think this is about as far as I'm going to go through for this morning. We'll go over this tomorrow. But the four schools are called thing. There are four called thing and character and state and relative dependence. So these are the four different types. So one is called the thing. It depends upon the thing, the transforming thing. The second is the characteristics transforming. The third is saying that you're moving from one state to another. And the fourth is saying is relative dependence, saying it depends. So to go through the commentary, it'll become clear if I go through the commentary. So they, the Sarvastivadins, that is, have four traditions called transforming thing, transforming characteristics, transforming state, and relative dependence. So these are the four: transforming thing, transforming characteristics, transforming state, and relative dependence. So these four. So the first of these, that is a transforming thing, is the tradition of the Venerable Dharmatrata. So he says that as dharmas progress through time, that is, as they go from being a past thing, first they're future, and then they're present, and then they are past, right? The thing transforms, but the substance doesn't transform. So in the future, it's a future thing, but it's still the same substance. In the present, it's the present thing, but it's the same substance. And in the past, it's a past thing, but it's the same substance. The substance doesn't transform, but the thing does. The example he gives of it, or the analogy he gives of it, is if you destroy a gold vessel and make it into something else, the shape has changed, but the gold's color and nature do not change. So this is a transforming thing. They're saying you've got the gold vessel, the gold jug, and you decide, well, this gold, that's not the nicest gold jug. I'd really like to have a gold bowl. So you melt it down and you make it into a bowl. The shape is different. The usage is different, but the color is the same. It's still gold. So the thing is transforming, but the substance is the same, he says. Now, the second is the tradition of the Venerable Goshaka. So what Venerable Goshaka says is that as dharmas progress through time, in the past, it possesses the characteristics of the past, but it does not possess the characteristics of the other times. The other times are, but it does not possess the characteristics of the other time. That is the important double negative here. It does not possess the characteristics of the other two times. So in other words, when it's in the past, it also has the future and the present characteristics. And the other times are similar in that when it's present, it has the present characteristics, but it still also has the past and it has the future characteristics also. And then in the future, it has all three times the characteristics of all three times. And the analogy he gives is when one man feels manifest lust for one woman, or when one person feels manifest lust for any other person, they are not free of desire for others. You see beautiful person A, and you feel lust. Well, that's not going to stop. You maybe still feel lust for beautiful person D. It doesn't matter. You still have that. You have that. And so that's the analogy that he gives. And then the third tradition is the tradition of Vasumitra. So the tradition of Vasumitra is called the transforming state. So the state of the thing changes. And this Venerable Vasumitra says, as dharmas progress through time, when the action has not been done, they are future. Like in 40 minutes, we have lunch, at least here in Vancouver. In 40 minutes, we have lunch, so it's future. The action of eating has not yet happened, so it is future. In 40 minutes, so when the action is being done, they are present. So when the lunch is on my plate and I am shoveling it into my mouth, it is present, right? When the action has been done and ceased, they are past. So when I have finished and my stomach is full and the plate is empty, lunch is definitely past, right? So those are the three. So when the action has done and ceased, they're past. So when they go from one time period to another, they're different in terms of being in a different state, but not different in substance, he said. So it depends upon the action. Is the action to happen in the future? Is it happening now? Or did it happen in the past? That's the difference. The substance is the same, he says. For example, he says, if you put a token in the ones column, it is called 1. But if you put it in the hundreds column, it is called 100. It's like you have an abacus. You have to remember they didn't have computers back then. And so you had abacus and you'd put something on the 1 column or on the string. You put a bead on the ones place, it would represent 1. If you put it on the tens, it represents 10. If you put it on 100, it represents 100, right? The token is the same no matter which one you put it on, but it represents different things. That's the analogy for this one. And the fourth is the tradition of Venerable Buddhadeva. He says that as dharmas progress through time, in relation to earlier and later, they are called differently. For example, one woman can be a mother, both a mother and a daughter. So the dharma is the same. It's just that in relation to one thing, it's called the future. In relation to another, it's called the past. In relation to yet another, it's called the present. It's just like all dependent upon each other. So this is the tradition of relative dependence. So we had these four. The tradition of, the transition of the transforming nature, the transforming characteristics, transforming state, and then relative dependence. So these are the four main traditions. So here, of these four traditions, the third is best because the times are there presented through their actions. So the third, this is the one of Vasumitra's position of the transforming state. So the first transmission, the one of transforming nature, is actually exactly the same as the Sankhya school. So this is that was the tradition of Venerable Dhammatratta, the transforming thing. The transforming thing is, that's one where they say it's the substance just changes in form, like the gold, vessel changing into a gold pot or whatever. The substance is the same, but the form is different. Well, this is subsumed within the non-Buddhist Samkhya tradition because it says that Dharma is completely transformed. In other words, the Samkhya tradition is another very influential school of Indian thought, Indian philosophy. In fact, it's kind of like the foundation of many of the current philosophies that we have, yoga and Kashmir Shaivism and many other philosophies kind of come out of or heavily influenced by the Samkhya thought. And in that position, they say that things transform over time, but that the future things, they say like, for example, when you have a lump of clay, then the pot that a potter could make out of that is also present in that clay and so forth. So that's their position. So that's basically, so that's not a good position because it's essentially saying the same thing as the Sangha school. And the second tradition is of transforming characteristics. That's the one where they compared it to you can feel lust for one person, but still feel lust for other people. This is the position of Venerable Goshaka. And so this is, everything has the characteristics of all three times. So the future things also have the characteristics of the past and present. And present things are the characteristic of the past and future. Past things still have the characteristics of the present and the future. And so if they all have the characteristics of all three times, then they'd all get mixed up. The times would get mixed up, he says here. You would not be able to tell past from future. And then the fourth is illogical as well. What was the fourth? The fourth is the relative dependence, which is the position that said, the position of Buddhadeva, which said that it depends, in relation to one thing it's past, in relation to another it's future, and so forth. So that is also illogical because at any one time, all three times would be present. Because even a present thing is still like your present, like the present thing is still past in relation to the future and still future in relation to the past. And so it's still all three times are present at once. So therefore, all of all these traditions, the third, the position of Vasamitra, transforming state, is the best position. And the reason it is the best is because the times of past and so forth are presented through or in terms of their actions. Any dharma that has not yet performed its action is future. When it is doing its action, it is present. And when the action is done and ceased, it is past, so it is heard. So this is the third one, and this is the one that is considered the best by Vasubandhu. So at this point, I think this is a good spot to leave this for today. We will get into the rebuttals of this. I'll start off tomorrow with, again, a review of these four, because the first time you hear something, it's always hard to retain it. So we'll start with a review of these four tomorrow. And then we will, what do we say? We have the review of this starting tomorrow, and then we will go on to the rebuttals of these positions. So these are the positions of the Great Exposition School. They're not necessarily, in fact, they are not Vasubandhu's position, as we'll go through tomorrow. So what time is it now? I think I've spoken a little bit longer than sometimes. Maybe we will hold off on questions until tomorrow. Actually, does anyone have a burning question right now? If you have a burning question now, otherwise maybe we'll give more time for questions tomorrow. Maybe just one question if someone has something really important right now. Maybe not. Okay, then we will have the questions tomorrow. So we will now recite the, what is this? We will now recite the dedication and aspiration prayers. So please think to yourself that that you are dedicating all the merit of listening to and discussing the Dharma today to the benefit of all of our mothers, all sentient beings throughout space, and think that by doing this, we may it bring them all to may we obtain liberation and omniscience ourselves, and then be able to free them all from all sorts of suffering, the birth, age, sickness, and death, getting things they don't want, not getting what they want, keeping what they have, and so forth. And so please, thinking in this way, let's recite the dedication prayers. O sanam de tam je se bani 돕는 예배라남 밤제대 개간하지 발롱주바이 시베토레로 근유로쇼 chancho samcho rinpoche maje panang gejurochi Kepa nyamba mepa ryang gongde gongdu pelwar sho. Okay, so thank you very much for listening today. I look forward to seeing those of you on Zoom tomorrow. So take care of yourselves, be careful.